All right, Dr. Kramer, what do you think? Should we get going? Make the best
Sure.
use of this hour?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. You are here for your first integration faculty panel. My name is Dr. Prieto. I'm in the Department of Sociology. Dr. Kramer, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Kathleen Kramer. I'm a professor in the School of Engineering. I'm a professor of electrical engineering.
And our goal for this session is to have an interdisciplinary conversation on a common topic. In this case, it's going to be focused on the COVID pandemic. And the idea is that you'll get a sense of how sociology on the one hand and engineers on the other approach this common issue. So what we'll do is we'll each give a presentation about 10 to 15 minutes. We'll pose a question to each other, and then we'll throw it open to all of you to see what questions, comments, critiques that you might have. And we'll do our best to keep that within the 1 hour so that you can enjoy the rest of your evening or morning, depending on where you are joining us from. Sound okay? Very good. So I will share my screen with you and I will make the first presentation, then I'll turn it over to Dr. Kramer. All right, so I'm calling this presentation, first of all, can you see my screen okay? Wonderful. So I'm calling this presentation Reframing COVID and its Solution, an Institutional Perspective. So I'd like to do a couple of things with you. The first is to talk about the data. So sociology is a fundamentally empirical discipline. I'm sure Dr. Kramer would agree the same around engineering. So I think it always makes sense for us to start with the data. So we'll do that to get us oriented. I'll introduce you to a really common sociological concept that my intro to social students, who are some of whom are on this call, are already familiar with, and this is the sociological imagination. So when you go to do your assignment for the integration, the first year integration component of your LLC course, and you're asked to name the piece about sociology, you might name this concept right here. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we've done in response to coronavirus, what we could still do, and then I'll flag what a sociological response to coronavirus would look like from my perspective. And what I think it does is it begins to disrupt what I see as the false choice between public health on the one hand and the economy on the other. But before we get going, let me ask those of you who don't already have your full names entered on your Zoom account, if you could rename yourself with your full name now, and that'll ensure that you get attendance credit for being here today. So if you've never renamed yourself in Zoom, just mouse down to the bottom of your screen and click the button for participants. You should see a long list of names there, everyone who's on this call. Find your name, hover over it, click more, and then rename. And enter your full name there in Zoom. That way we make sure we have a record that you were here. All right, let's get going. So let's start with the data. The first map that you're seeing is both of these maps are produced by the New York Times, and this is coronavirus trends in the US and then globally there on the bottom. And what you can see is a couple of things. So in the US, we're at about 5.7 million cases since they started tracking this back in March. And our deaths are up to almost 180,000. And this actually gets pretty close to what Dr. Anthony Fauci predicted for August back in March, which was 200,000 deaths in the United States. Looking globally, zooming out, we see 23.6 million cases and 814,000 deaths. So these recent infections, in the US anyway, they continue to be concentrated in the US South. And if we have the opportunity, I'll share these slides with you, and each of these images is clickable and will take you to the tool in the New York Times so you can explore the data for yourself. But if we were to pop open a map of coronavirus infections in the US, you see that most of them are concentrated in the US South and to a lesser extent in the Southwest and the Midwest. And even if we were to zoom in and just look at the difference between San Diego County, where I'm coming from, and Imperial County, which is right next door, we see a tremendous divergence in both the rate of infection and the rate of death. And so one of the things that I want to do when I talk about thinking sociologically is to try to explain the divergence in those neighboring counties. And what I'll focus on is what we call social structure. And these include dynamics like race, class, and occupation. So let's zoom out again. Let's look at the global picture. Of course, the virus is a global phenomenon, and here we see both interesting convergence and divergence with the patterns in the United States. We see convergence in the initial wave of infection as the world came to understand what the coronavirus is, followed by that period of lockdown and the much discussed flattening of the curve. The goal during that period was to fortify our health system and institute new technologies and systems that would keep virus levels low enough so that we could continue on with some semblance of normal life. And the primary way that we've discussed doing that is through testing and tracing, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. But no national infrastructure has been put in place. To this day, there is no national plan. And so it was left to states who variously implemented either aggressive or lax precautions against the spread of coronavirus. And the result was a resurgence of the virus that dwarfed the first peak, mirroring that global reopening trend that you see on the global trend line. But finally, we've diverged from the global pattern most recently as more states have adopted some level of precaution and as the virus takes roots in places where it hasn't already widely spread. Another way to think about these two charts would be to compare to see if the US proportion of all deaths is comparable to the US proportion of the global population. So just doing some quick and dirty math, we know that the US population is about 4.25% of the global population, but we represent about 22% of all global coronavirus deaths. And this disproportionality signals to us that something somewhat unique is happening in the US case. So what might it be? These data are really large, the global data, and because that's true, it disguises a great deal of variation from country to country. Some of that variation you're seeing on the screen right now. In places like China and Italy, which impose very strict lockdowns and have kept their numbers low, we see lower levels of infection continuing into the present, whereas in places like France and Spain, we've seen major resurgences after reopening. But the data that you're looking at here are total cases, so comparisons between them are difficult to make without standardizing the metric, right? Or creating some kind of common denominator so we can reasonably compare one country to another. And so that's what we do here in this next slide. Now we're looking at one of the most significant data points from my perspective when it comes to coronavirus, and that is deaths. Here they're standardized as deaths per 100,000 in the population, and what you can see from the graph, this is from Johns Hopkins University, is that the US is fourth in the world when it comes to deaths per capita, behind Peru, Chile, and Brazil, where authoritarian leader Jair Bolsonaro, who's gotten a lot of press coverage, has long denied the existence or severity of COVID, much like our own president. So how do we think about the problem that coronavirus represents? This is the part where sociology intervenes, and the answer to this question comes to bear on what we think we need to do in response to coronavirus. So let's turn to a little bit of sociology. This would be a great thing to mention in that integration assignment I flagged to you at the beginning of the presentation. And this concept is the sociological imagination. And the basic insight here is that our personal troubles can't be understood without understanding the social issues that structure those personal troubles in the first place. So when I say personal troubles, I mean problems that arise in your immediate sphere of influence. You experience them as individuals, and this perspective is reinforced by a widely shared American culture of individualism, right? And this is how we tend to think through trouble in everyday life, that it's something that affects us as individuals. What we do in sociology often is try to tie those personal troubles to broader social issues. And indeed, personal troubles grow out of those social issues, which are experienced collectively, and they're informed by the powerful but often overlooked social institutions that give them shape, right? And when I say social institutions, when I say structure, I mean things like government, healthcare, education, and so on. So the big insight here is that individual effort and technological innovation are important pieces of the puzzle in solving coronavirus, but they cannot be effective without institutions that organize resources socially. So let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by applying it to two examples. The first of these I teach with a lot, and this is the idea of controlling coronavirus transmission on college campuses with the student code of conduct. I think all students just recently received an email like this from the Dean of Students, and lots of American universities are sending messages like this, chastising students for being right. You should be responsible. You shouldn't be selfish. You shouldn't party. Don't gather. Don't travel, right? Here we're treating coronavirus transmission and our response to it as a personal trouble, and therefore the solution operates at the level of individual behavior. The logic here is that if we can get you to modify your behavior, we can drive down coronavirus transmission. If we were to pivot and think about this from a sociological perspective and see this as a social issue, the problem is not individual students' behavior, although that's an important piece of the puzzle. The problem is reopening, period, right? Because we know, and as we're seeing across the country, whenever we reopen, some level of transmission begins to happen, right? So our sociological response would not just include individually chastising students, but would include things like testing, tracing, and isolation, which, as I'll make the case in just a moment, requires federal funding, public education, and perhaps most importantly for us, political solidarity. So this is one way that we can pivot from thinking about coronavirus transmission as a personal trouble to a social issue. And in doing so, we change the kind of response that is required. Let's do it now with contemporary examples of coronavirus as it happens across racial groups. So one of the things that we would see if you popped open that map from the New York Times and compared San Diego County to Imperial County is that San Diego County has a lower rate of transmission and a lower death rate than Imperial County right next door. Imperial County is home to a large population of working class Latinos. And so our own public health officer has tried to make sense of why it's the case that Latinos have higher rates of coronavirus transition and death than whites. And so Dr. Wilma Wooten, who's our local public health officer, got into some hot water the other day when she suggested that Latinos are more affectionate and they have more underlying health conditions, and that's why they transmit coronavirus more often and are more susceptible to death when they catch it. One other way we could think about this, again, if we were to treat coronavirus transmission across racial groups as a social issue, is to think much more basically about occupational segregation. Latinos tend to be concentrated in those occupations that we have deemed essential work, and they are therefore exposed to coronavirus on a much more regular basis than other kind of workers who, like me, are able to work from home. And so the basic fact of occupational segregation here, I think, offers us much more explanatory power than cultural norms for this group or for underlying health conditions that are themselves tied to these forms of structural inequality. And so a sociological response to that social issue might look really different, right? Instead of telling people to change their cultural habits or eat better, it might look something like hazard pay, universal masking so that essential workers are protected from coronavirus transmission, ongoing unemployment benefits, and then, of course, the big one, quality education, which is the thing that spurs social mobility out of the working classes and into the middle class, right? And of course, the big threshold there is the bachelor's degree. Once you attain the bachelor's degree, your economic outlook is typically much, much different than if you don't have one. Right, so here's two examples of the way that we can use the sociological imagination to change the way we see the cause of a problem and consequently what its solution could be. So what have we done here in the United States? One of the common sort of conceptualizations of what a coronavirus response looks like is encapsulated in this phrase, the hammer and the dance. And this was popularized by a journalist named Tomas Puello, who talks about the hammer as the lockdown period, where we flatten the curve, we preserve hospital capacity to deal with coronavirus infection, and critically, we use that time to innovate and organize so that when we come out of the lockdown, we have systems in place that keep coronavirus transmission low, so the rest of us can go on with some semblance of normal life. We kind of did this in the United States, but largely we left it to states. And as we saw just a moment ago, the variation from state to state in terms of transmission is very high. There's also no national strategy for coronavirus testing. There's been a tremendous emphasis from the White House and from some congressional leadership on reopening and ongoing public resistance and political resistance to masking and physical distancing. And so we certainly flattened the curve, but when we came out of it, this period called the dance, we didn't really have much to show for it except for that preserved hospital capacity. So when we think about the dance, that piece is what we do after lockdown, and that involves testing, tracing, and isolating. It exists, and it exists here in San Diego. If you navigate to the coronavirus public health website of the County of San Diego, you can see a variety of metrics, one of which is tied to testing and tracing. And when we reopened just a few months ago, we saw that very quickly our testing and tracing capacity was completely overwhelmed. We went from initiating 94% of all coronavirus cases, initiating a contact with the tracer in 94% of cases, down to less than 10% of cases. This signaled to us how quickly the testing and tracing capacity could be overwhelmed. right? And so part of the reason this is true is that hiring continues to vary a lot from state to state. Testing supplies remain spotty. Lab capacity remains limited. We have no technology to enable testing and tracking as they do in other countries like China, like South Korea, like Singapore. And we haven't had a new wave of federal funding since the initial CARES Act to propel those kinds of systems, right? Combine that with the push to reopen, and what it looked like when we came out of lockdown was not a steady plateau, but a much larger peak the second time around. We have seen a lot of investment in the vaccine, right? We've seen massive investment through Operation Warp Speed. And because of this, optimistic projections suggest that a vaccine will be ready in early 2021, but a question remains about how it will be produced and how it will be distributed, right? So the idea here is that we've done some stuff, but we haven't done nearly as much as we've seen in other countries, right? So based on that, and based on what public health officials suggest, what could still be done? Well, testing would require coordinated national buying of supplies. It might involve invoking the Defense Production Act, whereby the executive takes over or compels certain corporations to produce testing materials and run those tests. We did this a little bit around Ford and the production of more ventilators, but we haven't done very much with it since. And that would help us get to what experts say need to be our basic testing capacity, which is something like 1 million to several million tests per day in the United States, as well as a national testing database, which does not exist today. This would also include an element of tracing. This would mean more tracers, so literally hiring more people to do contact tracing, but countries that have seen a lot more success here have enabled that tracing with technology. So this could look like public health officials being able to GPS track those who have become infected. It could also look like publicly available data of people who have been identified as having an active case, and then you could see on an app, for instance, where those people are, where they're traveling, and then you could avoid the places where people with active coronavirus infection are clustering. The final bit here is isolation, and this is the enforcement of quarantine orders, which happens almost not at all in the United States. And beyond just enforcement, it would also require supporting those who are in isolation with things like wage replacement, social services, right? Someone to deliver your groceries, offer childcare, support your family when you're out of work and in isolation. Right? So what all of that would require, all of that technological innovation, all of that systems innovation would certainly require a new round of federal money, unified messaging from political leadership, and public education. And so the big sociological takeaway here is that while individual responsibility is important and technological innovation is important, these are necessary but not sufficient conditions to mount an effective challenge to coronavirus. Right? Neither of these things on its own is enough to solve coronavirus when we think about it as a social issue and not just as a personal trouble, right? The response to coronavirus can only be effective if it's organized socially. This includes resources, political solidarity, right? In other words, coronavirus does not need to be a partisan issue, and the unity that we might be able to squeeze out of coming together around this might help drive down infection. So last point I'll make here is that we've seen a lot of calls recently for reopening the economy, whatever the cost. The push to reopen in May and June, unfortunately, didn't return the economy back to normal because it remains the case that most people simply don't feel safe to carry on as usual, and they continue to shelter to a significant degree in their daily lives, right? This has we didn't get the economic payoff, and it also exacerbated the virus transmission. So when we solve coronavirus, we solve the question of the economy. These are not opposed, but linked. If you fix one, you fix the other. And for me, it starts with appreciating the social fact that coronavirus is a social issue. And when we do that, we move away from distractions like reopening too soon or too late, careless students, selfish beachgoers, or whatever seems to be dominating headlines in the local news. Instead, it gets us oriented to the root issue, which as I see it, is government and its ability to create the social conditions that will make people safe and allow us to return to a semblance of normal life while we wait for a vaccine. In other words, with a robust and nationally coordinated testing, tracing, and isolation regime, it suddenly matters much less whether you went to the beach or a restaurant or a bar last weekend, because we've done the work of creating a system in which those activities can happen with far less risk than they happen today. So that's my take on sociology and the coronavirus. I turn it over now to my colleague, Dr. Kathleen Kramer. Dr. Kramer.
Nope, you're on mute.
Yeah, Dr. Kramer, if you might come up.
Thank you. Thank
Perfect.
you. Thank goodness. I have 3 children here at the house. I was trying not to share them with everyone. So, well, as I said earlier, I'm from the School of Engineering. I happen to be an electrical engineer. And so I thought we could use some perspectives from electronics and systems engineering. When I first became an electrical engineer, I quite honestly had no idea what it was. And so I think that unless you're in my Engineering 101 class, you might honestly have no idea what it is. And so here's my one page that I shared with the bridge. And so electrical, navigation, avionics, sensor fusion, and then my tagline, advancing technology for humanity on many fronts, that I'll tie in a moment. And in terms of my course mentioned, I'm teaching Introduction to Engineering. And so a quick definition of engineering, it's technical, professional, and scientific. So it's both a field or a discipline and a profession. And we're looking to take science, math, and technical understanding of the natural world and use it to invent, design, and build things to solve problems and achieve practical goals. In terms of collaborate, we have what's called the engineering social context. And so engineering interconnects with society, culture, and human behavior. Every product or construction of modern society is influenced by engineering. So engineering activity influences changes in the environment, society, and economies. And so its application, as we're taught as our responsibility, it brings with it the social responsibility to have concern for the public, for ethics, and for safety. And so looking at it, not just from an engineering point of view, but from a EE point of view, on the left, you have some aliases for electrical engineering or EEs. And so all these different names that you might hear, that's really an electrical engineer, also electronics, computer, etc. And our tagline for that this whole group of disciplines is advancing technology for humanity. And so to understand what questions that we would ask, and that's on your prompt, what questions do we ask, you want to look at what problems we like to solve. And so we're looking at electric power, computing, communication, and controls. And so I did a quick Google on what are the top transforming technical advances, not looking at my discipline in particular, but this is one particular list. You can get several lists, but they have the same proportion, I found. And so looking at this list, there's really only 9 things on it because the 10th is the next big thing. And of these 9 things, 2/3 of them are what you would call EE. And so 3 of them, you might say that's not really a EE. So elevator, human genome, and the automobile. Well, it's true that 100 years ago, elevators were mechanical. And they are doing a mechanical job because by definition, mechanics, you're moving things. But the elevator in the Burj Khalifa that's getting to the top, it better have a electronic control system or you're all gonna die using that elevator. And similarly, the Human Genome Project is, yes, it's a thirst for knowledge of what's going on molecularly in the human genome, but you're not getting anywhere with that without computing and communication and instrumentation. It's just not going to happen. Also, the automobile was a great invention. I don't know if Henry Ford, I don't want to say who invented the car, but it was a great invention, and it was it is a mechanical invention. And I have many students in this room, in the Zoom room right now, that are thinking, I love engineering because I love cars. I must love cars. And the cool new things that are happening with cars, self-driving cars, collision avoidance cars, that's not a mechanical problem. That's very much computing, communication, controls, artificial intelligence. And so it ends up that my discipline, I've taken over the entire list. So, ha! So in terms of our approach to things, Dr. Prieto, I believe it was the sociological imagination. Okay, and so for us, we have the engineering design process. And so this underlies, so we use this process and there's variations on it, but you almost always have a circle and you're starting with defining the problem. And so we are looking for you to give us a problem to solve. And then we're going to look for ways that people are already solving the problem and try to adapt and invent based on that. And we want to come up with alternative solutions. So we really don't like we know that there should be many solutions and that we should be picking based on something for good solutions or bad solutions. And we are expecting that our solutions are going to fail. We assume that this is the case, or this is what it is to have engineering judgment and to be experienced, is that you have to test and test and test and test, and it will fail. It will not, nothing worth doing will come out and work the first time. And so you have to expect to keep going back. And then in the end, you're always going to improve, and you should apply that as first years to your writing, but also apply it to everything else you do, that you're going to have to give it a go and then look and improve upon it and do more work. And at the end, there's a certain group of people that become engineers thinking, I'm not good at communicating, so I'll become an engineer. But you don't actually, you haven't achieved anything if your idea is still in your computer, in your garage somewhere, and it never gets implemented, then you have done nothing. And so the whole point of engineering is to solve a practical problem, and you can't solve it if you can't communicate it. And so that's the last step. And so our bias towards this process, whether we're designing something or not, we're looking, these are jobs we know how to do. And so we're looking to do them. And so in approaching COVID, an engineer would typically ask, well, how can I help? Meaning, how can I apply my skills and my little steps of the engineering process to solving this problem? How do I understand? And then also part of that, step 2 was the research and understanding the problem. And so we like to understand the problem in order to solve it. And so what our definition of understanding might differ a lot from Dr. Prieto's, but we would be looking to understand the problem. And so we're looking to employ data and models and methods, and we're looking at other solutions and like, well, this is just like the flu. How do we solve this? Or this is just like a air conditioning problem for a large building. This is just like putting out a fire. And so how can we solve that? And so a context for these questions to remember is that we are driven safety, ethics, concern for the public. And when I say safety, it's not personal safety, it's like our responsibility for other safety. So if you sell a car to people, and that car's, or a plane, for example, what it was at the 787 MAX, and that it spontaneously starts crashing, that's as an ethical failure, because the person using the plane can't be responsible for knowing, they don't know their risk. You have to know it for them. And the awareness of risk, and that everything has risk. And so every solution has trade-offs. So there's might be 20 ways we can design the brakes, but we have to, each of them has a likelihood of failure and other trade-offs associated with the expense. So we also have a bias that technology is the solution. And we know that that's not true, but we're looking to solve things with technology as a solution. And so we see ideas, inspiration, math, and science as methods to apply to get to that solution, with technology being the magic solution that we're thinking could help us. And hence, and many people see that, like the vaccine, that'll be the magic solution. So ventilators that Dr. Prieto mentioned, that's one of the first responses that people had. And so I don't mean first responders, but the first response that people had is like, we need ventilators. Ventilators are the fear. And so many engineers responded by coming up with projects to get ventilators to people. And so here's one that impacted our campus. So we have 2 professors, not engineers, but an open source engineering project put that out so that they could build some ventilators. So yeah, that was here on our campus. And then also on our campus, we had a 3D printing of face masks. Steve Saxer, those of you that are in engineering, you will meet him once you're back on the campus. He's into work even now, about 3 times a week. And then I started looking, so what about some ECE solutions? So those 2 solutions that you saw, the ones that first come to people's mind are manufacturing mechanical solutions. So what about ECE, electrical computer engineering type solutions? And so here is a local one, local but global, General Atomics. If you haven't heard of them, hear of them now. So they're famous for the Predator drone. But they also have invented this project they call Matchbox, and it's point of patient diagnostic systems. And that's a miniature device, requires almost no training to use, standalone platform for positive molecular identification in 30 to 60 minutes. And this, if those of you that have Netflix, if you see there's a documentary on Theranos, a biotech firm that basically it was a big fraud. This is exactly almost what they were claiming to do at that company. And COVID and the response to COVID have inspired people at General Atomics Electromagnetic Systems to actually, they were working on it for a long time, but they're transforming, like this is a true serious advance in testing that wasn't seen as possible prior to the urgency of the situation. Other ECE type approaches is to adapt artificial intelligence to do things basically bigger, faster, and with less personal bias, and that can be a better thing. So large pattern image analysis methods for identifying like who you might, sort of screening approaches, temperature, CT scans, using data science on like where you're observing cases. And we really still don't have a good handle on spread. We just have correlations. And so many of us, and I admit my own bias, that that this is where there's good systems modeling to occur. And my third and final example is the contact tracing. So I say the contact tracing, but when we're talking serious big tech, when Google and Apple get together. And this one I found interesting because when I was putting this talk together, I talked to somebody from General Atomics Electromagnetic Systems, and I was like, well, what else is like something interesting? And he's like, well, I'll tell, and he talked about this one, but he didn't want me to share this one. And he said, I am talking to you now without my cell phone in my pocket because I object to the privacy. and so there are some very intelligent people that are taken aback and are concerned about the implications of it. But there's also huge possibilities for impact with it. And if you look at what they're working on, they're very aware of the social overlap and the issues involved. And the name of it is, quote, privacy preserving contact tracing. And that can't be a happenstance choice on their part, I would say. And so, so those are three. And so in conclusion, and to hit something on your prompt for this integration panel, so some limits to this approach. So engineering that really advances technology. So like that Matchbox example. That's a General Atomics example. That's not, so I can care deeply that I want to have a Matchbox and make it available to people. That's not a single garage device to invent. So it's a big expert team and big money, and entrepreneurship has been a major innovative force. It's transformed entire societies based on these big companies coming into being and doing entrepreneurial things. But entrepreneurship is not going to solve COVID by itself. It can do good things, but it can't do everything. And alternatives to entrepreneurship, there are alternatives, but nothing works as fast. And so social good for an activity that is remote from the involved technical effort is another issue. And so we have people that have technical expertise that you need to achieve something, but the social good that is achieved from it is very distant in time, in space, from the actual technical activity. And so say somebody like me, you might ask me to design an IC, an integrated circuit, to do something for you. And I might change the world with my IC, but I'm not gonna, I won't meet one person in person about that. And so it's a very remote from the effect. And so when you volunteer to build a family a house and you have a group of people and you do it that weekend, that can get done and that can get organized in that way. But inventions that are going to transform the pandemic don't work that way, or they don't work that way naturally. And finally, the social context awareness, or the, I'm going to forget the sociological imagination. Okay, the sociological event, that is not necessarily a strength of my people. And so they might want it to be a strength, but it's not what they think of first necessarily, and it's not their social, it's valuable and important, but if it's not how they look at the problem, so solutions in the space have very different technical and non-technical constraints, and that's another limit. And that concludes. So I hope I didn't run over.
Not at all. Thanks so much, Dr. Kramer. We can make some time to ask questions of each other, but I'm cognizant that we have 20 minutes left with the students who are on the call. So maybe we can begin to solicit some of their questions, and as questions come up for you, we can pose those to each other as we go along. But why don't we start now by opening the floor to those of you who are on the call. Feel free to raise your blue hand or just come up off your mute and let us know what's on your mind. What questions do you have, comments, critiques?
Well, if they're scared, so I had some comments to share with you, Dr. Prieto.
Hit me.
So I love data. And so I love your data that you were showing. And so I wanted to point to, or maybe, and maybe could you share your data, like
Sure.
your slide with the data?
Let me show you I can actually show you the page on the New York Times that I often follow, and that way students can follow along. Let's see. There we go. So this is what I was looking at. This is global, and there we are for the US.
So go to the one that you had like the different death rates.
Oh, that is, I know what that is. That's John Hopkins, different site. Give me 2 seconds.
So we'll come down here.
So I too, I have my set of sites that I look at because I really do love data. And so I was looking at not this, so this is the one I want to talk about. And
Yeah.
so I found the other day, and I didn't flag it, but I'll send it to you. But what interested me was that it had, so I'm always looking for, because you want the per 100,000 for it to be apples to apples.
Right.
But I found another one, which I thought, well, this gets rid of all kinds of bias, because it was the death rate relative to the normal death rate.
Fascinating.
And so in California, the death rate relative to the baseline is at 109%. And so it's 9% higher than it should be. And so
Right.
they had some data where they said number of deaths due to pneumonia, whether or not COVID is involved, deaths due to flu, whether or not COVID is involved, deaths due to COVID, because if it's COVID, it's, you know, it counts, it all
Right.
counts.
Right.
And so it was very interesting, the differences between that. So overall in the US, it's 111% of the death rate of what it should be. So it's high by 11%. But if you were to exclude, so New York City, it's high by, it's 189% what it's supposed to be.
Right.
The
Because
state
the
of New
outbreak there was
Jersey-
initially so severe.
Right. Well, not just that, but the nursing homes. So I have a dear friend, her father was killed by it. You know, so in New York, New Jersey, they killed 30% of the nursing home residents with this, 30%.
Right.
That's enormous.
Yeah.
So the death rate in New Jersey is 140% what it should be. The death rate in New York is 125% what it should be. And so if you were to take those numbers out of our numbers, we move way down.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think this tells the local story about coronavirus transmission, right? I think, yeah, we see that a lot. I mean, the New York Times will report the transmission and death with and without, as you say, New York and New Jersey in the mix, and you see a really different empirical picture when you take those hot spots away. And so, I mean, one way to think about this is that, you know, other localities had the benefit of observing what those two states went through and then were able to respond, or for the simple reason that the virus sort of struck in those places later, right? They were allowed to kind of learn the lessons that New York and New Jersey taught us. But yeah, it's interesting to think about the way that toggling some of these variables really changes the outlook, right? I mean, if you move from deaths per 100,000 in the population to the observed case fatality ratio, so now this is deaths over total cases as opposed to the total population, the picture looks a little bit different. And now the US is what, down here in position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, right? So it's still not awesome, but a really significantly different picture, right? And you see Mexico here at the top.
Dr. Prieto, why? So I've seen this chart that you're showing, because of course I also go to the Johns Hopkins site all the time.
Yeah.
And why are the European countries not on this chart?
This is an excellent question. So I think one of the things, well, there's a lot to be said here. I think you could compare in broad regional terms the quality of health systems and the level of social inequality in those places. So if you were to compare Western Europe to South America and Mexico, for instance, you'd have a really different picture. And so I think the general sociological line here is that coronavirus simply exacerbates already existing conditions of inequality in health that manifest themselves in these kinds of data, right? So if we think about what class inequality looks like in Mexico relative to France, it's a really different picture. If we think about what public healthcare access looks like in Ecuador versus Spain, it's a really different picture. And I think, so right, so we could think about those kind of comparative elements. I mean, the other thing that I would point to is that a number of the countries at the top of the list have authoritarian leadership that have been like explicitly non-responsive to coronavirus, right? And here's where I think Brazil and the United States have quite a bit in common. In Mexico, AMLO, the president of Mexico, has basically written off of coronavirus, advising people to kind of use amulets or turn to not medical interventions to deal with the virus. And I think you see some of that expressed here. So I would point to the broader conditions of inequality between these regions. What are you thinking of?
So there are broader health inequality, but I think that frankly that it's not that their rates are below Saudi Arabia's, Dr. Prieto. I think they took them off this list. The British death rate is higher per 100,000, and it's just they're not on they're like for some reason they didn't put them on this list.
Interesting. Well, then we've got a note for John Hopkins, don't we?
So it's, for my part, when things really hit, by coincidence, I was in Peru at the time.
Oh, wow.
And so
Wow.
I got back, so I arrived in Peru Thursday, the 12th of March, for a meeting that was for people all across what I call Region 9, which electrical engineers call Region 9, which is all like Latin America. And so I was there for a meeting, and they had engineers in from all over, from Panama, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Brazil, everybody, and the meeting was in Lima. And things were really just changing. And so when I arrived in Miami on my way there, that was when Tom Hanks and his wife came, and things were hitting. So we get there, and my husband happens to have been born in Peru, and we get there, and people are there. They handed, actually, this is right in front of me. I got a hand sanitizer at the check-in of the conference. Right. And we had it was a great conference, great event. At that time there were 17 cases in Peru. And then we left on Sunday, and there were issues, but we got back. But several people at the meeting couldn't get back into their own countries because of the country's point of view was, we can't afford to have anybody come in because we don't have the health infrastructure. And so they were just stuck for a couple weeks. From many people, many countries took that view. It was very, I don't think I'll ever forget this experience, but it certainly, I was aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I bet if we asked everybody on this call, they could imagine, where were you when you first learned that this was a serious issue, or kind of understood it as a very serious issue. And it's interesting, right? I mean, even at the very beginning, some of these countries recognized how bad this would be, right? That they didn't have the infrastructure to deal with it. And so you kind of turn to these kind of like harsh mitigation techniques to try to keep spread low. But obviously, this is a very difficult thing to control. We're seeing how difficult it is here in the United States and around the world. I mean, and now I'm thinking more about your UK question. So if you were to see it on that map, I mean, so then I would come back to like local political conditions, which I think matter a lot for how coronavirus is transmitted. And I think Prime Minister, why am I spacing his name?
Prime Minister, Boris.
There we go. Boris Johnson, right, has taken a very similar approach to coronavirus that our own president has, right? So initially downplaying, right, and this really delayed a coordinated national response. And so what you get is this really varied region to region, locality to locality difference in how coronavirus is handled. right? California, which was the first state to go into lockdown, still had tremendous case transmission during that time because our lockdown was really different than the way it was carried out in places like Italy and Spain and France and China. It was, you know, we still had 50% of our workforce turning up for work because we had deemed them essential, right? So I think this is where I want to situate technical innovation and individual sort of smarts, right, in the broader political context that we inhabit. Because unless the political wheels are greased and moving in a way that serves everyone, right, this, even with countries with the greatest concentration of resources in the world, can't manage to tamp this thing down, at least for most of its citizens.
Mhm.
Yeah. We'll reinitiate, we'll renew our invitation. Questions, comments, thoughts, anything at all? You don't want to say it on the video, you can throw
Well,
it in the chat.
Yeah, put it in the chat. There's, I mean, we have 78 people. That is a lot of people. I could see that. Oh, Christian.
Yeah, and Alan has a question. Well, Alan, I don't see any other hands up right now, so why don't you what are you thinking about? Professor Jen from economics.
All right.
Professor Jen, you have a question there?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what you said, Greg, earlier. Speaking as an economist, the economy is not going to recover until the virus is dealt with. We're coming back a little bit in terms of what the economy is doing, but we're not going to get back fully until people feel comfortable about going to the movies, going to eat in restaurants, going to sporting events, traveling again. So the economic problem is really then going to be solved when the viral problem is solved.
Right, and I can't think of a clear example of integration and interdisciplinarity in the contemporary moment than this one, right? There is no solely economic fix to the economy, right? It has to be a collaboration between public health considerations and economic ones. If we're gonna get back to a place, you know, where unemployment is normal and GDP is normal, things that we are not seeing at all right now. Thanks, Professor Jen. Appreciate it. Others? Questions, comments, thoughts? Anything at all?
You also mentioned inequality. I want to plug our LLC panel on inequality then on October 27th.
Excellent. I see a hand from Benjamin.
Yeah, no, just a question that I had was, so like I've noticed how like the San Diego cases have like gone down a lot and it's getting much better. Do you think that's necessarily because of maybe people are actually deciding to quarantine and take care of the situation, or just fewer tests are being taken, or like what do you think's causing San Diego like to be like a lot better lately than it's usually been?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it has to be a combination of things. So one, I think it is growing awareness. People are learning to take this more and more seriously. I've seen this, like maybe you've seen this at local businesses that you frequent or places that you typically go. So I used to go to like Boulevard Fitness right here on University Avenue. And this is one of the gyms that stayed open through the lockdown. We're not supposed to be in gyms right now, right? They're still open. So this is a place that was like openly defiant of local public health orders, but only recent, like in the last 2 weeks, they have like announced on Instagram that we are mandating that everybody wears masks. And now when you look at their Instagram page, all the people in the gym are wearing masks, right? So there's really kind of slow uptake of the kind of individual level interventions that I talked about at the beginning of the talk that I think are contributing a good deal to the lower rates of transmission. But I think the thing that really matters is that here in San Diego, we took a couple steps back in our reopening. So you'll recall that like indoor dining back in June was open. Indoor gyms were open, and that lasted for a few weeks. We saw cases start to spike, and then we rolled some of that back. And now you see, if you drive down University Avenue, you see bars and restaurants have started to build out into the street so that they can host people in the open air, which we know is significantly safer than being in a closed space where you're inhaling a lot of these aerosolized particles. So I think the initial reopening experiment was something of a disaster. A lot of like US lives have been lost, a lot of lives around the world. People are starting to feel that, I think, and really take it seriously, because the death count grows every single day. But again, I think the piece is not just individual behavior, so convincing individuals, yeah, it's important to wear a mask, yeah, you should physically distance a little bit, but also what are governments doing to put parameters around acceptable human behavior, right? And I think when that piece comes back in, we start to see the dip that we're seeing now. And now we've really kind of leveled out at a plateau that's slightly higher than the first time we flattened the curve, but it is certainly flatter than we've seen. I wonder, Dr. Kramer, what you think. How would you respond to that question? And while you do that, I'll grab some data.
So I definitely saw that people were not being careful when there was the first opening, but I attribute a lot of that to, it was San Diego's season for Arizona people to be here. Like, I'll say Arizona people, but you know, all kinds of people, but particularly Arizona was climbing in cases. And the solution of many people from Arizona was like, well, we were going to go to San Diego anyway. And so or California anyway, because it's so miserably hot here in the summer. And so they brought it with them. And I remember being in La Jolla 2 days before they shut things down again. And I'm looking at this restaurant, I'll name them, Richard Walker's on Prospect. And I'm like, what the heck? It was just a madhouse with crowds waiting, and you can't be masked while you're eating and everything. And so, and they've taken over everything. Like, this is dangerous. This shouldn't be happening. And, you know, and of course, and it's all people from outside. So even if we had gotten our numbers down, you know, these are the tourists that are there and they're close. And so that was, I think that was certainly a factor. We have a border that is theoretically closed, but all the pictures show that it's wall to wall, people going back and forth. And it was, you could argue, our fault that it got over there, but it keeps, there's a much higher rate at this point around the border, and they have not. So if people are essential, let's keep them on one side or the other. But that border is wide open, effectively wide open. If all you have to do is say, I have a doctor's appointment, and you're in.
Let's see. Great question. Much appreciated. I think we got time for one more. Any others? Thoughts, comments, criticisms, things that you're hearing from friends and family that you want to bring in here? Maybe it doesn't fit with what we said. Maybe it does.
I can ask something. I mean, Dr. Prida,
Yes,
you were talking about kind of like how San Diego opened a little early and there was kind of like a spike. What do you think? Would you think that kind of relates to like opening USD or colleges in general? I mean, I think you have to weigh the benefits and the things that could go wrong. I mean, I think what's your take on that? Like, do we try and go back and then a possible surge, or I think it kind of relates to like, yeah, I think it could relate.
Definitely. I think that's a great question. So let's bring that broader sort of San Diego pattern into USD. And I think it comes back to what I said about sort of switching our perspective from thinking about coronavirus as just a personal trouble that you might want to avoid or you don't really care about, or whatever your particular perspective is, right? To what it means to think about coronavirus as a social issue that impacts an entire community. And one of the things that like your faculty have really been intensively dialoguing with administration about is what it means to bring thousands of young people back to the space of Linda Vista. We know, as you're seeing across the country, there's no tamping down on cases when you gather young people together. And I don't really fault young people for that, right? If you come to college, I get that no surprise that people want to party and hang out in dorms and be together, right? That is the heart of the college experience, right? It's the number one thing my first years care about. They don't care about their academic, right? They want social life. Where are my friends? Where am I going to find my people, right? How am I going to find purpose in this life? All that good stuff. I don't think we can leave it to students to do the work of driving down transmission and therefore insulating the working class community where our school is located, right? Where you will be shopping and living and drinking and partying, right? That will be happening in that space, and those people will become exposed, right? So when I think about USD, I think about one of the core principles of our mission, right? You may have seen these in some of your orientation materials. We often refer to ourselves as an anchor institution. And the idea here is that USD is not just a university on the hill that's only accessible to the most privileged elites, right? But that it is an anchor institution that supports the broader community through jobs, through educational opportunities, right? And by providing services in the form of, for instance, like that community engagement stuff you might be being asked to do in your classes right now. I think that piece has been tremendously underplayed because perhaps naturally administrators are focused on how do we bring in those tuition dollars that are going to make sure we survive as an institution. I think that's a reasonable consideration, but I don't think there's any way that you can reopen, right? I don't think you can have it both ways, not until we have a much more robust infrastructure in place that keeps transmissions low. So when I think of the solution to colleges and coronavirus, I think the only real solution in the absence of all that public health infrastructure I was talking about is not reopening, is being remote. And I think that's exactly why all of us are on Zoom right now, because we got as far as we could trying to hold on to the hope that if we reopen, we can keep transmission low, right? We're just gonna send you a bunch of emails, right? We're gonna say, right, you gotta take your health survey at the beginning of the day, don't get together with friends, right? We know that's not gonna work in the United States, most recently at UNC. And I think that is where we need a structural solution right now, that is closing and being remote, right? And so that for me, is an important way that we can kind of link the sociological piece with the broader mission of our university, which is to be of service to the community that we're situated in. And we can't do that if we are one of the hubs for coronavirus transmission.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. What about you, Dr. Kramer? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think I'm a little more pro open than Dr. Fredo, but I've got three high school children in my household that I would like them in school, and I'd like them in school now. But that being said, I think that, so they approved, last I saw, I haven't looked in the last few days, but they've approved 27 schools to open in San Diego. I think from a practical point of view, it was impossible for USD to open. When the governor's orders were in place, I've come to appreciate much more than I had before in the wake of all this, the importance of the county, and that public health is really, whether people know it or not, it's a county thing, and they have to report to the state. And so we rely on the leadership and the direction of the state. The county really can't decide to go rogue. And so when the governor said all K through 12 cannot open, if your county's on the watch list, that was done. And there was nothing the university could do to open at that point. It became an impossibility regardless of your opinion of anything. It was just not, it's essentially, even if it wasn't officially so, it was a legal impossibility. But once you have schools actually opening, and so you will be having what, from my engineer's point of view, is testing will occur. So as you have these 27 schools open, things will happen. And we're seeing across the country, Aiden, in response to your question, you've seen some schools have opened, and then a couple of them have had to say, whoa, we got a big breakout. And then, but a number of them are doing fine. And so the ones that have had breakouts, the testing and tracing has very quickly identified what the heck was going on there. And so I'm very optimistic. And it could be just that I'm naturally optimistic, but I'm optimistic that by next semester, the other people will have been testing these systems and structures for us. And that if we have high schools open, I think that'll set a bar that'll support that. at the university level.
I really appreciate that nuance. And you can see, I mean, in response to your question, Ada, it doesn't have to be all one thing or the other. We can, as a community, make choices about where transmission is acceptable and where it's not, right? I think it makes a lot more sense to prioritize middle schoolers, high schoolers in person than it does college students, right? And, you know, for intellectual development reasons, but I think also high schoolers don't live at their schools typically, right? And that is a different context, right, than here. So I think there's a lot of room to kind of strike some balance between what we'll permit and what can't be permitted.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Well, I think this is time. We're
Yeah.
about there. So should we just say thank you very much for joining us for this evening chat?
Thank you very much.
Yep.
The
and we'll
first
see you all in
Collaborate
class soon.
integration panel.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.